Salam alaikum. Welcome to Kunafa and Shay, a podcast produced for HowlRound Theatre Commons, a free and open platform for theatre makers worldwide. Kunafa and Shay discusses and analyzes contemporary and historical Middle Eastern and North African, or MENA, and SWANA, or Southwest Asian and North African theatre from across the region.
I'm Marina.
And I'm Nabra.
And we're your hosts.
Our name, Kunafa and Shay, invites you into the discussion in the best way we know how, with complex and delicious sweets like kunafa and perfectly warm tea, or in Arabic, shay.
Kunafa and Shay is a place to share experiences, ideas, and sometimes to engage with our differences. In each country in the Arab world, you'll find kunafa made differently. In that way, we also lean into the diversity, complexity, and robust flavors of MENA and SWANA theater. We bring our own perspectives, research, and special guests in order to start a dialogue and encourage further learning and discussion.
In our fourth season, we focus on classical and historical theater, including discussions of traditional theater forms and in-depth analysis of some of the oldest and most significant classical plays from 1300 BC to the 20th century.
Yalla, grab your tea. The shay is just right.
So first off, I have to admit that I don't know very much about the history of the Ottoman Empire. It's an incredibly vast and important time in the history of the world and crucial to the global influence of Islamic scholarship, art, and science. Nevertheless, it was a part of history that was so blatantly skimmed through in my history classes in school that you can only attribute it to racism and Eurocentrism, even for someone who spent her formative learning years in Cairo. American schools all over the world uphold the American trend of the erasure of non-Western histories, folks. Even though Ottoman history is the history of the West as well, it was still pretty robustly erased from my learnings. The empire exemplifies more than any since the most vast of the Greek and Roman empires, the exchange between Eastern and Western cultures. That is why it can be so difficult to talk about the Ottoman Empire without centering Western artists. So much literature discusses the performances of European plays in Istanbul and the influence of prominent European playwrights in Turkish theater. Turkish ambassadors to other countries imported theatrical productions and styles. Foreign embassies in the empire held performances at the embassy buildings, and foreign residents, visitors, and touring productions from across Europe were influential parts of theater in the Ottoman Empire. However, for this episode, partly to keep it relatively brief, and partly to continue our tradition of decentering Western perspective, we will skip over the parts about European practitioners as much as possible. As the episode undoubtedly inspires you to research Ottoman theater further, you can learn plenty about the performances of Molière's plays in Istanbul, the favorite playwright of Ottoman royalty, and tours of European operas like Aida and so on. We will be informing you about Turkish-specific Ottoman theater and Turkish theater traditions, acknowledging that Turkish theater throughout the ages, and especially in the Ottoman Empire, had myriad global influences, since Turkey has always been an important trade center, and Istanbul has always been a multicultural, cosmopolitan city.
So I'll get into a tiny bit of context about the Ottoman Empire to frame the episode. I also have to give a shout out to my friend Denise, who is Turkish and sent us a voice recording with some pronunciations for this episode. Denise, we will do our best, and all Turkish listeners, we're trying really hard. So please do feel free to let us know in what ways we can do better with our pronunciations. So context about the Ottoman Empire. The empire lasted from 1300 to 1922, so more than 600 years. It expanded as far north as modern-day Austria, as far east as Kuwait and Saudi Arabia, as far south as Egypt, and as far west as Algeria. Among other modern countries, it included Hungary, Greece, Ukraine, Iraq, Syria, Libya, and of course, the heart of the empire, Turkey. When the empire fell, it was replaced by the Turkish Republic and various successor states in southeastern Europe and the Middle East. Clearly, the empire was incredibly vast and influential, so we'll really only be scratching the surface of the history of theater in the region.
There are three major forms of traditional Turkish theater that we'll be covering today. Ortaoyunu, or also known as a play performed in the open. Karagöz, or shadow theater, and Meddah, or storytelling. Ortaoyunu is an interactive multimedia theater form performed in the round with ample audience engagement and music and dance integration. This form dates back to the 13th century. It has an improvisational structure with no written text traditionally, but rather a performance sequence along with known stock characters that are integrated within a plot that the actor or actors create. The Turkish Cultural Foundation outlines the structure of the performance. Quote, Orta Oyna begins with raucous jujunabas dances and again ends with dances. The actual play taking place between these two dances. The main parts of the performance are prologue, dialogue, play, and ending. End quote.
The stock characters are distinguished by social class and region through outfits and mannerisms. Supernatural beings are also often integrated into the performance. The two main characters of Ortaoyunu are Kavluku and Pisakyar. Quote, while Kavluklu is a type who represents the common people, Pisakyar fits the definition more of a semi-educated type. Pisakyar is a flexible character who tells everybody what they want to hear, knows how to make people smile, is a mediator who can quell disagreements and reconcile the estranged, is moderate, fits into any mold, is ready to overlook people's faults, and knows how to keep quiet when it's in his interest. He always puts a positive spin on other people's evil words and intentions, as well as doling out advice and acting as a counselor. He is well spoken, listens attentively to what others say, and earns the confidence and affection of one and all. Although his knowledge is superficial, he has a definite opinion on every subject. In the play, he is the first to appear on stage to greet the spectators. Kabuklu follows in his wake and is followed in turn by the dwarf or hunchback type, who is dressed in a costume exactly like the Kabuklu's and mimics all his actions, which gives rise to comic situations. End quote. And that was from the Turkish Cultural Foundation. We can definitely look at how this ableist stereotype has performed throughout the centuries, but it's just worth flagging that here. Additionally, how gender often worked in these situations, men would act out female roles with their faces partly veiled, and a musical ensemble would accompany the action throughout.
An important change occurred with Ortaoyunu during the Ottoman Empire. Westernization and European influence led to many of the texts of these plays being written down, the format changing from theater in the round with no fourth wall to being performed on a stage, and the play subjects being influenced by popular European plays of the time. These changes are largely attributed to the Tanzimat reforms enacted by Sultan Abdulhamid I starting in 1839, which were heavily influenced by European ideas. Many art forms began to more heavily draw from European influences after that reform, including theater, which we'll talk about more later. The new form of theater that was born out of Orta Oyna at this time was called Tuluat. It was still improvisational in nature, but integrated many of the hallmarks of Western theater we see
Another
today.
form of traditional Turkish theater is Karagöz, or shadow puppetry. There are so many forms of puppetry across the SWANA region, which we've talked about and will talk about in other episodes. Karagöz translates to black eye, which is attributed either to the dark paint around the puppet's eye or the haunting look of the main character. The two characters in Karagöz shows were the titular, Karagöz, and his friend Hacivat. Karagöz is the unintelligent, silly, foolish character, while Hacivat is clever, kind, and the foil for Karagöz. Karagöz is thought to represent the illiterate but practical and straightforward public. Hacivat may be a stand-in for the educated class. Their misfit adventures led to many fun and comedic storylines.
Neslihan Kojak, in an article on the Daily Sabah, outlines the flow of a typical Karagöz show thusly. Quote, the play consists of 4 parts. The first is the preface or the prologue. Usually, the depiction of a house or a forest is raised slowly upward from the bottom of the screen. First, Hacivat comes onto the screen and invites Karagöz by reciting a couplet, a catchphrase, if you will. Karagöz accepts this invitation and starts bickering with Hacivat. The second part of the conversation involves Hajivat and Karagöz asking each other riddles. They describe an event or a dream they saw as if they were real. The third part, the main act, is the play. In this part, where the main subject develops, other characters are introduced according to the context. Ghazals, a form of poem or ode, also occupy an important place in the music of this section. Finally, there's the finale or the epilogue. In this very short chapter, the main part of the performance is over and the events are resolved. When Hajivat's line, "You destroyed the curtain, you ruined it, I'll let the owner know right away," is heard, the audience knows that the play is over. End quote. Legend has it that these two characters were based on real people who lived during the reign of Orhan Bey in the mid 1300s. Karagöz and Hacivat were said to be construction workers at a mosque whose silly antics led them to be executed to keep them from further slowing down the construction process. The religious leader of the time, Sheikh Kushtere, allegedly felt so bad about this execution that he immortalized them as puppets. It should be noted that the play's stage is called Kushtere Square after this sheikh. According to the Turkish Cultural Foundation, Karagöz was first performed either during the reign of Sultan Bayezid I or Selim I in the 15th or 16th centuries, respectively. But the origins may trace back much further, since Karagöz is thought to be influenced by the Havanese shadow puppet tradition of wayang kulit. Karagöz gained popularity across the Ottoman Empire by the 17th century, where it became a staple of the holy month of Ramadan. From private homes to public coffee houses, people would gather after iftar to watch Karagöz and Hacivat's legendary
The third and
antics.
final form of traditional theater that we'll talk about today is Meddah, which translates simply to storyteller. And it is just that, a single storyteller depicting the entirety of a play. Meddahs would perform at public or private venues, as well as at special occasions like circumcision celebrations. Some Meddahs were like celebrities, and people had their favorite Meddahs in town that they would try to see perform. Some sultans even had their own personal Meddah. The Meddahs would perform a breadth of stories depicting legends or daily life. They were comic, dramatic, literary, or moral, or a blend. Some stories were well known and others were brand new. During the month of Ramadan, Meddahs were even more popular. After iftar, people would go to the Tarawih prayers, where a portion of the Quran is read every night, and then to the closest coffee house to watch the Meddah. The Meddah would appear on a tall chair so everyone could see him. Then, as Akram Bura Ekince describes, he threw his printed fabric handkerchief on his shoulder, hit his stick on the ground 3 times, clapped his hands, and began to tell a rhyme, starting Hak Dostum Hak, meaning, "It is true, my friends, Allah's truth." He tried to stress that his words were the truth and indirectly use God as a witness for what he was about to tell. Hak is one of the names for Allah in Islam. Then the Meddah began telling a story. He often used the stick in his hand to either silence the crowd or imitate certain sounds or objects such as a saz, broom, rifle, or horse, and he had headgear or a tambourine in his basket or jacket to be used according to the person whom the Meddah was impersonating. And this is very similar to the Hakawati that we would talk about in other storytelling traditions. So the Meddah is, we see sort of existing differently throughout different countries.
There were also known Meddas who each had their own mannerisms and signature phrases, like using certain headwear to impersonate different cultural groups prevalent in the empire, or well known for their poetry, or perhaps their jokes, or even a certain story that they would often tell. In his article in the Daily Sabah, Ekince ends with this intriguing story of one famous Medda. Quote, following a military mobilization, Medda Sururi was called up and began his drill at the Bayezid Tower. When the commander aligned soldiers and put heavy sururi at the front, soldiers laughed boisterously. The soldiers would listen to his imitations, and when they saw him, they could not help but laugh. Even his movements made them laugh. The commander got angry, but even with sururi standing in proper position, soldiers continued to laugh. When the commander realized that he could not deal with him, Sururi continued his military service as a typist. It is unknown what the other clerks did with him. End quote. That story, although again bringing up some ableist connotations, shows that this Meddah Sururi would have been known for his particular form of physical comedy, and he was so famous that these soldiers immediately knew him and thought he was hilarious just from looking at him. And so, even trying to be in the military, this Meddah was unable to escape his comedic reputation. So you can just imagine how much of fun and famous celebrities these Meddahs were. I really wish I could have heard one of them telling their story.
Prior to the 1800s, traditional theater forms like Ortaoyunu, Karagöz, and Meddah were seen across the Ottoman Empire. The 19th century marked a new era in Ottoman theater due to major political reforms and treaties at that time, which led to greater European influence mixed with various censorship laws that shaped the future of Turkish theater. We will mostly be drawing from two articles: The Ottoman Theatre 1839 to 1923 by Nermin Menemenjolo and The Rise and Development of the Modern Theatre in Istanbul by Mehmet Fatih Uslu. Menemenjolo summarizes this period in this way, quote, the destruction of the Janissary Corps in 1826, the Reform Edicts of 1839 and 1856, the Treaty of Paris at the end of the Crimean War, which admitted the Ottoman Empire into the concert of Europe, each inaugurated a new phase in Turkish theater, while the ascension of Abdülhamit to the throne brought about a period of censorship and repression, during which the theater survived but made little progress. End quote.
While we are avoiding too much discussion of non Turkish theater in the Ottoman Empire, we would do a disservice not to talk about the Armenian influence at this time. Armenians played an important and widely recognized role in the development and spread of theater in the Ottoman Empire, especially shifting theater from an upper class or royal activity to one that included the general public. Armenian amateur theater began in 1810, and Armenians became the majority of the actors on stages in Istanbul. One of the reasons was because women, and especially Muslim women, were not allowed to perform, so Armenian women did. Also, Armenians performed Western plays in both Armenian and Turkish languages to public audiences. Three westernizing sultans at the time, Selim III, Mahmud II, and Abdulmajid, were very interested in European performance, and the general rule of the empire was what the sultans like is what thrives. There were hundreds of Armenian actors and a professional Armenian theater troupe. Armenians were the pioneers of Western style theater in the Ottoman Empire, which became a major influence on the development of Ottoman theater as a whole throughout the 19th and 20th centuries.
The Ahravalian Tadron, or Eastern Theater, is thought to be the first professional theater in the Ottoman Empire, established in 1859. The Vartovian Theater performed bilingual plays in Armenian and Turkish. It is notable especially because it increased the number of original Turkish and Muslim plays being performed in Istanbul. The Asian Theater, which was renamed the Ottoman Theater, is widely considered the most important theater of the empire. It was established in 1867, and in 1870 the government provided its founder, Gulu Agop, a 10-year monopoly to perform Turkish plays in Kadıköy and Üsküdar, two major districts in Istanbul. Gulu Agop was, unsurprisingly, of Armenian heritage. As we said, the Armenian influence on Ottoman theater cannot and should not be ignored. The theater had 3 tiers of seating, including a box for the Sultan. The foyer served coffee before these performances, with live Alaturka music playing. There were even stables for the horses and carriages for audience members. So, free parking. The first play in Turkish was a translation of Cesar Borgia by an Armenian, Karabet Papazian. The actors were all Armenian. The second play was Leyla and Majnun by Mustafa Effendi, based on the Turkish folktale that is the focus of another episode in the season of this podcast.
Gulu Agop's monopoly on theater in Istanbul did have some important provisions, though. Barkay Jomert says in an article for Medium, quote, Opera and similar musical genres would be excluded from this monopoly. Also, according to the specification, he had to establish a theater within 6 months in Uskudar, within 3 years in Galata, Topane, and Beyoğlu, within 6 months in Istanbul, and if he did not do so, the monopoly would be removed. 10 different games would be played in the first year, which would be increased in the following years. Regardless of profit and loss, at least 50 performances would be given every year in Uskudar, 30 in Galata and Istanbul. The last three provisions of the contract were that compulsory demonstrations for the benefit of the poor would be made. A gendarme would be in the theater, and ticket prices would be regulated. End quote. This was the exact opposite of the government's stance on theater in the past, that it was exclusive to the elite class. Now they were mandating that it would be accessible to the people.
The first original theater texts in Turkish were by Azerbaijani playwright Mirza Fatali Akundov. But many consider the first genuine Turkish play script, meaning written by a Turkish playwright in Turkish, to be The Marriage of the Poet by Ibrahim Shinasi in 1859, originally written for Dolmabahce Sorayi Theater. It is a one-act comedy, first released in serial form in the newspaper that Shinasi ran. In fact, newspapers were generally important to the growth of theater in the empire, since newspapers started around the same time that stage plays began. So the reviews and articles about theater in newspaper popularized the art form further. The play came about shortly after Sultan Abdülmecit's 1856 reforms, quotes, in which he pledged again equal treatment of all Ottoman subjects, regardless of race or creed. As dress, social ritual, and family life were transformed, so the values of traditional divan poetry, of the medieval tale of rhyming couplets, the play and the round for which no written text existed, were questioned. The stage was now set for the Turkish innovators. Soon after signing the new edict, he began to build himself a new palace at Dolmabahce. It was for the theater in his palace that Ibrahim Senasi Effendi wrote the first Turkish play, Şair Evlenmişse, The Poet's Marriage. The plot and characters were not unlike those of the old Turkish theatrical show, or Ortaoyunu, except that the play was meant not only to entertain, but also to point out a moral, that the marrying of an unseen bride could have unpleasant consequences. End quote. And that was from one of the aforementioned articles, which we'll include here.
According to Wikipedia, because I couldn't get access to the original source, quote, Shinasi employed a Turkish language that was closer to the vernacular rather than the vocabulary and structures previously used by the cultural elite. He intentionally distorted the way he spelled words in order to make the language more phonetic and to aid in the performance of the play, end quote. He wrote this play for the people instead of for the elites, which was a testament to how theater had expanded and gained broad engagement at this point. Our good friends at Wikipedia summarize the play in this way, quote, in the play, a poor young man became infatuated with a beautiful woman, but according to Muslim tradition, grooms were unable to see the faces of their brides until after the marriage contract was finalized. The family of the beautiful woman used the stipulation to their advantage when they secretly replaced the young poet's beloved with her highly unattractive older sister. The young man was eventually reunited with his darling through misdeeds of his own. End quote. Okay, a little bit problematic, but the play was a satirical criticism of traditionalists through the criticism of arranged marriages. From the preface to Edward Allworth's translation, the play shows, quote, the impatience of the new men with old practices, satirizing go betweens and arranged marriages. But it also chides the emerging self styled intellectuals and poets for their pontificating about theater, artistic pretensions among the ghost of a towering literary heritage, and pseudo liberalism coupled with snobbery toward the less educated. End quote. And yes, they decide to write theater as Thiyyator. So unless that's some type of Turkish term, I think that's just Edward very well, like well articulating the kind of snobbery of theater in a brilliantly respelled
Yeah, like
word.
theater.
So I could not help myself. Theater, theater. So here is the opening of the play we're gonna perform for you, in the translation, which is the most famous translation by Edward Allworth. The scene is between the groom and his friend. Do you wanna be the groom, Mr. Ardent Hack, or his friend, Master Wise?
I will be Master Wise.
Amazing. Get ready for the best cold read you ever heard. At last! This evening I become a bridegroom. Luckily, I signed the marriage contract today. If I hadn't, passion and excitement might have made me an unwed bridegroom.
Is such a thing possible?
Why not? If it's a love match, as they say.
Shocking.
Now, see here. If a husband can get along without passion or affection, fine for him. But what am I marrying Miss Dove for? Because she's my darling, and nothing else. Wasn't I sane to fall in love with her so madly?
Maybe so.
Ah, the freshness of her beauty, the sweetness of her disposition, everything about her pleases me. Now, if my poor dove just did not have a big sister with a face like a crow.
Oh, a shame. What do they call her?
Miss Placid, I believe. Even the name of the wretched woman bothers me.
Why is that?
When it comes to good looks, she's destitute. But forget about that. Besides staying out of circulation until 45, her brains have gone bankrupt too. I guess there's nothing to her except an overinflated hulk. I'm ashamed to be seen with such a sister in law. And end scene. As I said, politically incorrect, but admittedly kind of amusing.
Well, also, I just want to point out, so when Nabra was doing research on this episode, I was talking to the aforementioned Turkish friend Denise, and she said, "Oh, like growing up in school, we learned a lot about Ottoman theater in the classroom." And I said, "Oh, great. Can you send me the resources?" And she was like, "Yeah, Marina, they're in Turkish. Do you still want them?" I was like, "Oh, great point." But Nabra really liked this scene and so was trying to find different translations of it and found one that was, I mean, honestly baffling. And then found this one, and we were able to sort of put them side by side and say, okay, I think we see what they were doing, but this one makes a lot more sense. So the labor of finding it, Nabra, we really appreciate it because it's interesting to see sort of how we're able to piece some of these sources together in English, but also a need for a more sort of coherent and cogent narrative to be constructed in English. And I know that there are plenty of scholars who are working on this now. Um, but it's just, I think, something that we continue to point out on the podcast, and it's interesting.
Yeah, it was amazing how difficult it was to get my hands on this. I ended up going to the LA Public Library, shout out public libraries, and had to like scan it because it was not in circulation. But there is like, it also showed me the importance of translation because the like Amazon.com preview of some random version had such a bad translation. It was so bizarre, and we just wanted to do as much justice as we could to these very important playwrights of the Ottoman Empire, even though, it doesn't translate as well culturally, I guess, to the present day where there's this, very difficult, misogynist narrative really in this play. And without knowing that it was a critique of traditions and that this character was not supposed to be likable, it could be taken very differently by modern audiences. And I think that's also why Allworth has these stand-in names instead of the other translation I found had actually the Turkish names that were in the original play as the names of the characters, but instead, Allworth has these terms, Mr. Ardent Hack and Miss Dove and Miss Placid, instead to kind of show what they were supposed to symbolize. And maybe that goes back to uh, origins like Ortaoyunu, which had a lot of stock characters, and even Karagöz had these stock characters that were really of the culture and of the art that they were performing.
Don't forget that I was aptly named Master Wise.
Yes, please don't call me Mr. Ardent Hack from now on, unless I deserve it.
Now that the idea is in my head.
No, she's so mean to me. Anyways, to return to our narrative on Ottoman theater, I hope you enjoyed that artistic interlude. Menamanjolo tells the story of another important local production in very compelling detail. So I'm going to give you a long quote by her. The play is by the very important Ottoman playwright Namik Kemal. So Menamanjolo says, quote, within 2 months of the formation of this committee, which was this literary committee that was very important that we'll talk about shortly, Namik Kemal had completed a play whose production was to be the great dramatic event of the century. Vatan, or the fatherland, or Silistria. The play is based on an episode in the defense of Silistria on the lower Danube, which the Russians were unable to capture during the Crimean War. Hub ul Vatan, or love of the fatherland, an ideal advocated by Kemal in many articles and letters, motivates the action. A noble young man forms a group of volunteers to join the war. The girl he loves disguises herself as a soldier and follows him to the front. Trumpets sound, guns are fired, martial songs are sung. All ends well. The lovers are united and the enemy is defeated. Guluagop imported Russian uniforms from Odessa and ordered elaborate stage sets. News of the forthcoming production filled the city with excitement. On the evening of Tuesday, 1st of April, 1873, the theater was packed with members of the higher bureaucracy, writers, intellectuals, and students. From the very beginning, the impassioned tirades were interrupted by applause, and when the curtain fell, there were calls for the author to appear. He had already left the theater. A group of spectators carrying lanterns to see by in the dark streets marched to the offices of Tabrit, or the Example, of which Kemal was the editor, shouting, "Long live Kemal! Long live the fatherland! This is our wish! God grant our wish!" End quote. So exciting. Theater needs to be this much of an event again all the time. Just and people marching through the streets chanting afterwards. I just love that.
Well, and I want to add quickly that the more that I'm learning different Turkish words, I've taken 2 Turkish lessons now, so 2 whole hours of Turkish, um, is that when Nabra was reading, you said Vatan, the fatherland, Nabra, but the similarities to Arabic are quite striking, right? So in Arabic, we would say Watan is homeland, and then hub, she said hub ul Vatan, love of the fatherland in Turkish, and I'm sure our Turkish friends, perhaps our pronunciation is not perfect, but hub in Arabic is also love. Um, so it's just always interesting to see these connections of language. And of course, there are particular reasons for that, which is not the aim of this podcast to discuss right now, but wanted to point them out.
By 1867, there were 3 professional groups in Istanbul, and the circus could be considered the 4th. According to Uslu, quote, during this period, Muslim intellectuals in the Ottoman Empire saw playwriting as an important sector of artistic production, and there was a boom in both copyright and performance, especially regarding Turkish playwriting, end quote, which is a change from the more improvised versions of theater.
Yes. So, generally, original plays were not published since they would be the subject of censorship from the Ministry of Education if they were. Censorship was especially intense during the reign of Sultan Abdul Hamid from 1876 to 1909. Censorship at times was absurd and difficult to navigate, which we see today too. Some words that were outlawed in print were Yildiz, Cyprus, Crete, Macedonia, Bosnia Herzegovina, Marat, dethronement, socialism, strike, anarchy, freedom, equality, constitution, explosion, and nose. That is correct. Nose. The last one was to ensure that the Sultan's nose was not insulted, especially due to the popularity of the play Cyrano de Bergerac, which was not allowed to be performed. But due to the oral tradition of Turkish theater in the past, there was not initially a desire to preserve texts in this way anyway. That started to change, however, with the establishment of professional theater companies who were starting to perform and develop Turkish plays in the Turkish language, instead of European plays from non Turkish playwrights. There were more Turkish actors on the stage, and theater was an art form for the public, not just the Sultan. A major step in the development of playwriting as a recognized form of literature in the empire was the establishment of the Ottoman Theatre Literature Committee in 1873. The stated objectives of the committee were 1. Solving the Armenian actors' pronunciation problem, which was seen as the most problematic issue of Turkish theater at the time, despite the major Armenian influence on theater across the empire. There was still a strong nationalist sentiment that discriminated against them in certain ways, and newspapers often criticized Armenians' quote, poor pronunciation of the language on stage, end quote. But this committee did lead classes for Armenian performances, which resulted in what some have written about it say led to a more positive popular opinion of their performances. The second stated objective of the committee was enriching the theater literature with the help of the translated works from European languages. And the third goal was correcting translations and adaptations made in a superficial manner. And four, improving the national theater literature by writing as many plays as possible. And I think it's always just useful to point out when we're talking about uh, Armenians generally that this nationalist rhetoric did eventually then lead to the Armenian genocide, which is sort of being foreshadowed here in many ways. So I just did not want to skip over and ignore that, especially currently in times of genocide. It's always worth pointing out these things as we're sort of seeing them in different texts.
Absolutely. Throughout the researching for this episode, it was actually really difficult to figure out this balance of the popular theater and the interest and excitement around Armenian performers and writers and playwrights, and also this strong nationalist sentiment of trying to push the Turkish theater and the Turkish language work and Turkish actors. So it's strange and it's hard to figure out what really the atmosphere was at the time through, scholarly articles. So thank you for pointing that out, Marina. So in the late 1800s, really, theater boomed. The McGraw-Hill Encyclopedia of World Drama describes plays that focused on heroism and nationalism, historical plays, plays based on mythology and folktale, biblical themes, protests against polygamy, commentary on superstitions, plays about contemporary life, works that satirized neighboring countries, romantic comedies, comedies of mistaken identities, marriage controversies, class commentaries, tragic romances, and more. In 1884, the Ottoman Theatre Company was abolished by order of Sultan Abdulhamid, and this coincided with the increased censorship that we mentioned earlier, and theater as a whole nearly disappeared for a time until the next revolution.
The Young Turk Revolution of 1908 greatly changed the social and thereby artistic atmosphere of the empire. Censorship was ignored, and forbidden plays were performed to large crowds. The Fatherland was widely performed. According to Menemenjolu, theaters mushroomed. There was a sudden plethora of plays with titles like, in translation, Morning of Freedom, The Last Days of Abdul Hamid, and Intrigue in the Palace. What gradually emerged in this rather confused period was that a truly national Turkish theater was being created. The plays of this period concerned themselves with the political and social problems of the day and with the projection of a new concept of Turkishness in place of the old Ottomanism. During this period, political theater was a way to express dissatisfaction with the previous regime, as well as enthusiasm toward the new social period, which came to be known as the Second Constitutional Period. From the Young Turks Revolution in 1908 through the Turco Italian War of 1911, the Balkan War of 1912, World War I, and finally the Turkish War of Independence that led to the end of the Ottoman Empire in 1922, theater reflected the politics of the time and dealt with topics related to the struggle of the Turkish people against their enemies in war, or historical Turkish war heroes. One company called Osmanli Donema Cimiyeti was formed specifically to raise money for the purchase of warships.
In 1914, the liberal mayor of the time, Jamil Topuzlu Pasha, inaugurated the music and drama conservatory called Darul Bedaye. It was a huge moment in Turkish theater history. World War I interrupted the school, of course, but it started up again after the war, operating mostly as a theater group rather than an educational establishment. And eventually, it led to the establishment of the Istanbul Municipal Theater, which still operates today. Very notably, young women were allowed to study at the conservatory, and in 1920, the first Turkish Muslim female actor, Afife Jaleh, played the lead in a Turkish play entitled Yamalaj. And that brings us to the end of the Ottoman Empire in 1922. This overview was incredibly brief and obviously does not cover the entirety of theater history in the empire. The empire was bursting with creativity and artistic expression and had so many impactful and influential plays, performances, playwrights, actors, directors, and theater makers of all kinds from so many different backgrounds. But I hope this overview gives you an idea of the rich atmosphere of theater in the Ottoman Empire, and like all of our episodes, encourages you to do your own research and learn more about this robust theater culture.
This podcast is produced as a contribution to HowlRound Theatre Commons. You can find more episodes of Kunafa and Shay and other HowlRound podcasts by searching HowlRound wherever you find podcasts. If you loved this podcast, please post a rating and write a review on your platform of choice. This helps other people find us. You can also find a transcript for this episode, along with a lot of other progressive and disruptive content on the HowlRound.com website. Have an idea for an exciting podcast, essay, or TV event the theater community needs to hear? Visit HowlRound.com and contribute your ideas to the Commons.
Yalla, bye!